The wind that scoured the plains of Arizona territory carried the grit of red sand that stung the eyes and tasted of endings. It swept through Dust Rock with the weary sigh of a ghost, rattling the signs of the mercantile and the saloon promising nothing but more heat and more hardship. The town itself was a handful of sun-bleached buildings clinging to life by a dried-up creek bed, a place where the saloon doors never stopped swinging and secrets were traded cheaper than whiskey. On a blistering Tuesday afternoon, Colt Rollins guided his steady gelding Shadow down the town's only street. Dust puffed up from the horse's hooves, coating Colt's worn boots and the patched denim of his trousers. He was in town for salt blocks and coffee, a simple errand that felt like a journey through a furnace. The air was thick enough to chew, shimmering above the baked earth. He tied Shadow to the hitching post outside Potts's mercantile, giving the horse a reassuring pat on the neck. The world shattered a moment later. The explosion of glass from the Dust Rock Bank and Trust was so sudden, so violent, it felt like the sky itself had cracked open. A woman screamed a high, thin sound that was swallowed by the immediate thunder of hoofbeats on dry earth. 4 riders, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, burst from the bank's splintered doorway. Colt's hand instinctively dropped to the Colt Peacemaker, holstered at his hip, his body tensing with the muscle memory of 100 forgotten skirmishes from a war he'd tried to leave behind. He moved behind the water trough of the rough-hewn wood pressing against his back, his storm-gray eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. This was no ordinary robbery. The men weren't grabbing sacks of cash and fleeing. They were methodical, their movements sharp and angry. Their leader, a tall man with a brutal economy of motion, barked orders. The box, just the box. One of his men emerged, clutching a small, iron-strapped lockbox. He tossed it to the leader, who secured it to his saddle horn. They weren't interested in the teller's cash drawer left hanging open like a broken jaw. They had come for one thing. As the leader mounted his horse, Mrs. Albright, the banker's wife, stumbled out onto the boardwalk, her face a mask of terror. A silver locket on a delicate chain around her neck caught the unforgiving sunlight. The leader's head snapped towards the glint of metal. He spurred his horse forward, leaning down from the saddle with predatory grace. "That's pretty," he snarled, his voice a gravelly rasp muffled by the cloth. He didn't ask for it. He ripped it from her throat. The chain snapped, leaving a thin red line on her skin. She cried out more in shock than pain. The world went silent for Colt. Through the swirling dust, he saw the glint of silver, a locket swinging from the leader's gloved fist. It was oval with delicate etchings of a songbird on its surface. Identical. It was identical to the one he had given his wife Sarah on their wedding day, the one she was wearing when he buried her 5 years ago. His breath caught in his chest, a knot of ice and fire twisting in his gut. For a half second, the dust-choked street of Dust Rock became a quiet graveside under an old oak tree, and the scent of sage was replaced by the smell of freshly turned earth. The leader saw him then. Their eyes met across the chaos. Even through the mask, Colt felt a jolt of cold, calculating intelligence in the man's gaze. There was no recognition, just a flicker of assessment before the man wheeled his horse, raised a pistol, and fired a single shot into the air. A reminder from the Harper Freight Company, he bellowed the name, a strange, nonsensical declaration. Debts will be paid. Then they were gone, a whirlwind of dust and thunder, vanishing into the vast, indifferent desert. Colt stayed frozen for a long moment as the image of the locket burned into his mind. It couldn't be Sarah's. It was impossible. But the gut-deep certainty was a physical blow. He pushed himself upright, his errand forgotten. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary face was a roadmap of every trouble the territory had thrown at him, was already there, kneeling beside Mrs. Albright. He was a good man, but he was one man against a land that bred hardness and desperation. Colt Brody said, his voice heavy. You see which way they went? South. Towards the pass, Colt answered his own voice, sounding distant. Sheriff, that lockbox. What was in it? Brody helped Mrs. Albright to her feet, his expression grim. Old property deeds. Nothing of monetary value, not unless you were looking to start a war over ancient history. Mostly Rollins and Harper family holdings going back 30 years. The name struck Colt again. Harper. The writer had shouted it. He filed the information away, a cold piece of a puzzle he didn't understand. And the locket. Brody shrugged his gaze, sympathetic. Just cruelty, I reckon. Some men aren't content to just take. They have to break things too. Colt nodded, but he knew it was more than that. The specificity of the theft and the deeds the locket felt personal. It felt like a message, and it was aimed at a past that he thought was long buried. He spent the rest of the day helping the sheriff and the townsfolk, his mind 1,000 miles away. The image of the songbird locket, a symbol of a love he'd lost now, felt like a harbinger of a violence he couldn't escape. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had a ranch to run, fences to mend, a solitary life he had carefully constructed to keep the ghosts at bay. But as dusk settled, painting the desert in long, lonely shadows, he knew he wouldn't be sleeping. The ghost of Sarah and the brutal mystery of the man who held a piece of her memory in his fist had hooked into him deep. He'd meant to ride straight home, but a different sound, closer and more intimate than the bank robbery's chaos, made him rein in shadow near the edge of town. It came from the Harper house, a dilapidated structure that seemed to sag under the weight of its own neglect. First the shattering of glass, then the thin, terrified cry of a child. Everyone in Dust Rock knew Jonas Harper. He was a man who had inherited his father's once prosperous freight business and had drunk it into the ground. More than that, everyone knew, in the way small towns know things without ever speaking them aloud, that his wife Evelyn and his young daughter paid the price for his failures. The code of the West was clear: a man didn't interfere in the affairs of a husband and wife. It was a line you didn't cross. But the child's cry had been a blade to Colt's heart. He thought of his own boy, Henry, taken by the fever alongside Sarah. He had failed to protect his family from sickness. He would not fail to protect this one from malice. He swung down from shadow, his movements silent and deliberate. The promise he'd made to himself to stay uninvolved had turned to dust, blown away by the cry of a child in the dark. As he approached the broken-down porch, the muffled, enraged voice of Jonas Harper carried through the splintered wood of the front door. It was the same gravelly, snarling voice from the bank. The same cadence of command, now slurred by whiskey, but unmistakable. The leader of the bank robbers and the monster in this house were one and the same. The public crime and the private cruelty had just collided, and Colt Rollins was standing right where they met. He pushed the door open. It crashed against the inside wall, nearly ripped from its rusted hinges. And so it began. Inside, the scene was one of quiet, suffocating terror. Evelyn Harper was pressed against the rough-hewn wall, a crimson trickle staining the corner of her mouth. Her eyes, the color of a faded prairie sky, were wide with a fear so old it had become a part of her. Little Margaret, a child of no more than 4, clung to her mother's skirts, her small face a pale oval in the flickering lamplight. Her silence was more profound than any scream. Jonas Harper stood before them, swaying. The room reeked of stale whiskey and his own simmering rage. 6 years he spat his fist, clenching and unclenching. And what do I have to show for it? A daughter. A goddamn daughter. He was a man drowning in his own failure, and he was determined to drag his family under with him. Jonas, please. Evelyn whispered the words, a fragile prayer. Margaret's a blessing. She's bright and good. The backhand was a blur of motion. Evelyn's head snapped to the side and stars exploded behind her eyes. The fresh, coppery taste of blood filled her mouth. "Don't you dare talk back to me." Jonas snarled, his face a twisted mask of fury. "You got one job, woman, and you failed me." He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her toward the bedroom. "Maybe I'll beat some sense into you. Make you give me a son." The door crashed open. Colt Rollins filled the doorway, a silhouette of quiet, immovable strength against the encroaching night. He was tall and broad, his shoulders hardened by years of ranch work and the heavier burdens he carried within. His storm-gray eyes, missing nothing, locked on Jonas. "Evening," Jonas Colt said. His voice was low and steady, but it carried the cold weight of steel. "Heard a commotion. Thought I'd check." Jonas dropped Evelyn and spun around, his eyes wild. "Get out, Rollins. This ain't your concern." "Normally, I'd agree," Colt said, his gaze flicking to Evelyn, her bruised face, and the small child huddled behind her. "But when a man wages war on women and children, it stops being private business." He saw the same boots on Jonas's feet, scuffed with a distinctive silver toe cap that he'd seen on the leader of the bank robbers. The certainty settled in him, cold and hard as a river stone. "She's my wife, I got rights." Jonas stumbled forward, raising a fist. "And you've got responsibilities," Colt answered coolly. "From where I'm standing, you've been failing at those something fierce." With a roar of pure frustration, Jonas lunged. Colt sidestepped with an easy grace, using the drunkard's own momentum against him. Jonas crashed into the kitchen table, which splintered under his weight. Before he could rise, Colt planted a heavy boot on his chest, holding him down. "Here's what's going to happen," Colt said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Mrs. Harper and her daughter are coming with me. You're going to sleep off your liquor. Come morning, you'll think real hard about what kind of man you want to be." "You can't take them," Jonas wheezed, the air pressed from his lungs. The law is a day's ride away," Colt said flatly. "Out here we make our own justice." Evelyn stared, frozen. Men didn't stand up to Jonas. They looked away, muttered about it being a shame, and went about their business. Yet here was Colt Rollins, steady as the mountains, choosing to fight a battle that wasn't his. He turned his gaze to her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than cold resolve in his eyes. It was a deep, aching gentleness. "Ma'am," he said, his eyes never leaving Jonas. "Gather what you need for a few days. My place is 5 miles out. It ain't much, but it's safe." I can't," Evelyn whispered, the ingrained belief that she was property, not a person with choices holding her captive. "Yes, you can," Colt said firmly. "Take the first step. The rest will follow." "Mama, please," Margaret whimpered from behind her. "I'm scared." Those words shattered Evelyn's paralysis. She had endured every blow for herself, telling herself it was the price of survival. But she would not let her daughter grow up in the shadow of Jonas's fists. With a surge of desperate courage, she snatched a small carpet bag stuffed in a change of clothes and a worn storybook and gathered Margaret into her arms. Jonas cursed, struggling beneath Colt's boot. "Stay put," Colt warned, his voice a low growl. "If you think of following, remember this. I was at Shiloh and Antietam. I've put down better men than you for less." Jonas's face blanched. He knew Colt's reputation, a man who had lost everything to fever, who had carved a ranch out of nothing but rock and grit. A man who was deadly sure with a rifle and had nothing left to lose. At the door, Evelyn hesitated, looking back at the man she had once promised to love and honor. "You took vows," Jonas spat, his voice laced with a desperate, pathetic fury. "And so did you." Her own voice, when it came, was stronger than she'd heard it in years. The vows were to love and to cherish. Tell me, Jonas, when was the last time you did either? Colt guided them into the cool night air, the scent of sage and possibility. A welcome relief from the suffocating stench of the house. He helped Evelyn onto Shadow, then lifted Margaret into her mother's arms before swinging into the saddle behind them. The solid warmth of his body at her back was a comfort she hadn't realized she craved. As they rode out of Dust Rock, Evelyn felt tears slide down her bruised cheeks. They were not tears of fear this time, but of a fragile, terrifying hope. Behind them, Jonas Harper staggered to his feet, his rage boiling hotter than ever. This was not over. But for now, under a vast Arizona sky, littered with stars, like spilled diamonds, three souls rode toward something new. A mother who had almost forgotten her own worth, a child who might finally grow up unafraid, and a lonely man who had just remembered what it meant to protect something precious. The first light of dawn painted the Triple R Ranch in soft shades of gold and rose. Evelyn woke to the unfamiliar symphony of a life lived in rhythm with the land and the gentle lowing of cattle, the rhythmic creak of a windmill pulling water from the earth, the soft nicker of horses in the corral. For the first time in 6 years, she did not wake to the sound of angry muttering or the smell of stale liquor. She did not wake to fear. She lay still in the small, clean guest room, Margaret's small hand resting in hers. The little girl stirred her voice, a sleepy whisper. "Mama, are we safe here?" Evelyn smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead, her heart aching with a fierce, protective love. "I think so, sweetheart. Mr. Rollins seems like a good man." Through the small window, she could see him already at work, mending a section of fence near the barn. His movements were steady and purposeful, a quiet display of competence that spoke volumes. He moved like a man who knew his place in the world and was content with it. This man had faced down Jonas without a flicker of hesitation. Why, the question echoed in the quiet corners of her mind. A gentle knock came at the door. Mrs. Harper. Colt's voice, deep and calm, carried through the wood. "Got coffee on the stove and some biscuits in the oven. Take your time, but they're there when you're ready." His footsteps retreated, leaving her space, leaving her a choice. That simple act of consideration was more foreign to her than the landscape outside her window. Jonas demanded. Colt offered. She dressed quickly, smoothing her worn calico dress, then helped Margaret into her little frock. The face that looked back at her from the small silvered mirror was a stranger's. Bruising bloomed along her jaw, and her lip was split. She hated for him to see her like this, so broken and worn down. But there was no hiding the truth of her life. The main room of the ranch house was a testament to its owner. It was simple, masculine, and meticulously neat. The furniture was handmade from sturdy pine worn, smooth with use. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and shelves flanking it were filled with books. Her hand, almost of its own accord, reached out to touch the leather spines of volumes by Shakespeare, Emerson, and Thoreau. She hadn't held a book for pleasure since before her marriage. "You can read them if you like," Colt said quietly from the doorway to the small kitchen. Evelyn jumped, pulling her hand back as if burned. He held out a steaming tin cup of coffee. "Anything in this house is yours to use while you're here." She accepted the cup, her fingers brushing against his. His hands were calloused and scarred, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Jonas never allowed. She stopped, ashamed of how small and weak her life sounded when spoken aloud. "Jonas isn't here." Colt said, his tone firm but not unkind. "His rules don't apply under my roof." Over a breakfast of warm biscuits and honey, Evelyn studied him in the soft morning light. He was younger than she'd first thought, not yet 40. But the lines etched around his eyes and the silver at his temples spoke of hard-lived years. He moved with a quiet economy, as though afraid of startling her or Margaret. He set the jar of honey directly in front of the little girl, who beamed with a delight so pure it made Evelyn's throat tighten. "Why did you help us?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Colt took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting towards the window and the wide-open land beyond. "My Sarah," he began, his voice softening with the memory she used to say the measure of a man wasn't how he treated his equals, but how he treated those who couldn't fight back. "I reckon I failed that measure plenty in my life. But last night, I couldn't just ride past." "Your wife Evelyn?" asked gently. "She and our boy Henry died of the fever 5 years back," he said, his voice even, but the weight of the words was immense. Henry would have been about Margaret's age now. The simple, unadorned statement of his loss resonated with her own. "I'm so sorry." "We all carry our sorrows, ma'am," Colt said, his eyes meeting hers. They were the color of a gathering storm, but held a deep, quiet kindness. The question is what we do with them. The days that followed settled into a strange and peaceful rhythm. Evelyn found herself rediscovering parts of the woman she used to be. She cooked meals without fear of criticism, mended clothes without a running commentary on her uselessness, and hummed old tunes as she worked. Margaret, freed from the oppressive silence of her own home, blossomed. She chattered endlessly, her laughter echoing through the small house that had been quiet for too long. Colt gave her small chores like feeding the chickens or brushing his gentle mare Buttercup, and the child took to them with a solemn pride. The ranch, a place built by a lonely man, began to feel like a home. One evening, as the setting sun bled purple and orange across the horizon, Evelyn sat on the porch, an old leather-bound Bible of her father's open on her lap. It was one of the few possessions Jonas hadn't destroyed. Margaret chased fireflies in the twilight, her small giggles like wind chimes. Colt sat on the steps cleaning a rifle, the scent of gun oil mingling with the sage-scented air. Strength and honor are her clothing, and she shall rejoice in time to come. Evelyn read aloud the words of Proverbs, a balm to her soul. "Your father must have been a good man," Colt said, not looking up from his work. "He was a lawyer," Evelyn whispered, a wave of nostalgia washing over her. "He believed education was a gift from God, meant for everyone. He taught me to read, to think." Her voice caught. Jonas disagreed. "Jonas is a fool." Colt said the statement flat and absolute. The simple, unhesitating defense of her intellect warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. On the third morning, Samuel Potts, the proprietor of the general store, rode out with a wagon of supplies Colt had ordered. He was a kind man, if a bit of a gossip, and his face was clouded with worry. He shifted uneasily on the wagon seat, his gaze darting towards Evelyn, before he spoke to Colt in a low voice. "Jonas is stirring up a hornet's nest in town, Colt, telling anyone who'll listen that you stole his wife and child. He's buying rounds of whiskey at the saloon, offering money to any man with a gun who'll back his rights." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She pulled Margaret close, her hands trembling. This was what she had feared, that her escape would bring violence to this good man's door. Colt's expression remained unchanged. He calmly began unloading the sacks of flour, stacking them on the porch as if Samuel had merely been commenting on the weather. "Jonas can shout all he wants. A man who beats his wife forfeits the right to claim her." Samuel Potts nodded slowly, wiping sweat from his brow with a handkerchief. "That may be God's law, Colt, but Sheriff Brody is calling it a domestic matter. Says his hands are tied unless there's a public crime. Then Jonas best pray he doesn't commit one." Colt said evenly, a dangerous glint in his eye. After Samuel had gone rattling away in his wagon, Evelyn turned to Colt, her voice trembling. Maybe Margaret and I should go. I can't bring this trouble to you. It isn't fair. He stopped what he was doing and faced her, his gaze direct and unwavering. The only trouble here, Evelyn, is the kind Jonas brought on himself when he laid a hand on you. This isn't about you bringing anything to my door. This is about a man who believes he can own people. If he comes here, he'll find me waiting. He said her name. Evelyn, not Mrs. Harper or ma'am. The simple intimacy of it made her heart skip a beat. Later, while unpacking the supplies, she noticed something odd. Jonas had been through her things before she'd left, not just in a rage, but systematically. A small wooden box containing her father's old legal papers had been dumped out, its contents rifled through with a strange meticulousness. She had assumed it was just part of his destructive tantrum, but now she wondered. He was looking for something she said to Colt that evening, describing the disarray. He was always asking about my father's things, about any special papers he might have left me. Colt listened intently, his brow furrowed. Did your father ever have dealings with the Harper family? I don't know, she admitted. He died before I met Jonas. I only know he was a respected lawyer here for many years. Colt didn't press, but she saw him file the information away. He was a man who noticed the details, who saw the pattern in the chaos. He knew just as she was beginning to suspect that Jonas's cruelty was not random. It was driven by something deeper, something far more calculated and obsessive than mere drunken rage. And it was all tangled up with the past, with the land, and with the secrets buried in her father's forgotten papers. The November sun blazed down on the Triple R hotter than it had any right to be for the season. Out in the west pasture, Colt was stretching new barbed wire, the muscles in his back and arms cording with the effort. His shirt was soaked with sweat, clinging to him like a second skin. From the porch where she was mending one of Margaret's dresses, Evelyn watched him. Every line of him spoke of a quiet, unyielding strength. He was a man who carried his burdens without complaint, who met the world head-on with steady hands and a steadier heart. When Margaret, her small face serious with her task, carried a tin cup of water out to him, he dropped to one knee to accept it. The smile he gave the child was a thing of rare, unguarded beauty, a gift more precious than gold. Evelyn's heart ached with an emotion she couldn't name, a dangerous mix of gratitude and a longing so profound it felt like a physical pain. A sharp curse carried across the yard. Colt straightened up, shaking his hand. He'd snagged his forearm on a barb, and a dark line of blood was already welling up, staining his shirt sleeve. Without thinking, Evelyn dropped her sewing basket and rushed to him. Come inside, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. That needs tending. It's nothing, he started to protest, but he followed her anyway, a faint, surprised look on his face. Inside at the kitchen table, she gathered a clean cloth, a bowl of water, and a bottle of whiskey. Take off your shirt, she instructed, her voice softer now. He hesitated for a moment, then unbuttoned it, slowly, shrugging it off his shoulders. Evelyn drew in a sharp breath. His body was a tapestry of his life. Faint, pale lines from old battles in the war crisscrossed his chest and shoulders, stark against his sun-darkened skin. Newer scars from ranch work and hard living told a more recent story. These were the marks of a man who had not just lived, but survived. She cleaned the fresh wound with gentle, focused care, her fingers brushing against his warm skin. She was acutely aware of every hitch in his breath, of the heat radiating from him. When she poured a little whiskey over the gash to cleanse it, he hissed softly. Sorry, she whispered, her eyes lifting to meet his. I've known worse pain, he said, his voice rough. Just not this kind of gentle. His storm-gray eyes were dark, burning with an intensity that made the air between them crackle. For a long, silent moment, neither of them moved. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their faces. Then, acting on an impulse that felt more right than anything she had done in years, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his chest, just over his heart. She tasted the salt of his skin, the honest scent of his labor. A groan escaped him, low and ragged. "Evelyn," he rasped, the sound a plea. His hands came up to cradle her face, his calloused thumbs stroking her bruised cheekbones with an almost reverent tenderness. "You're sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She whispered back, the truth of the words resonating deep in her soul. "I don't want proper. I want real. I want you." What followed was a revelation. It was nothing like the rough, selfish demands she had known. Colt was careful, tender, as if she were made of precious glass that he feared he might break. He kissed the bruises on her face, kissed away the silent tears that traced paths down her cheeks, and whispered her name like a prayer. He touched her as if she were sacred, and in his arms she felt her broken pieces beginning to knit themselves back together. When at last they lay tangled in the sheets of his bed, the afternoon sun slanting through the window, Evelyn rested her head on his chest and felt for the first time she could remember completely whole. Afterward, as the desert shimmered in the heat outside, he brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "I meant to court you proper," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, a true, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "This is better than proper, Colt. This is true." But the truth they had found was a fragile sanctuary in a world that would not let them rest. In Dust Rock, Sheriff Brody was piecing together the strange events of the bank robbery. He'd found one of the getaway horses lamed and abandoned miles south of town. The brand on its flank was from the old Harper freight line. It wasn't much, but it was a thread. He found Jonas Harper in the saloon, holding court with a bottle and a captive audience of drifters. Brody pulled him aside, his voice low. "Jonas, I need to ask you about your horse." Jonas's charm was oily and thin. "Which one? Sheriff? A man in my position has a whole stable." "The one that threw a shoe 5 miles south of here this morning," Brody said, watching him closely. A flicker of panic crossed Jonas's face before he masked it with bluster. "That's preposterous. One of my stable hands must have been careless." "It's a funny thing," Brody continued, his tone conversational. "The man who robbed the bank shouted your company's name. And the lockbox he stole contained deeds to land your family lost to the Rollins family 30 years ago. A man might start to think these things are connected." Jonas's face darkened, the false charm dissolving into pure venom. He leaned in close, his breath sour with whiskey. "That land was stolen, Sheriff. Elias Rollins was a thief who drove my father to his grave. He used some legal trickery cooked up by that snake of a lawyer, Evelyn's father, to do it. The law did nothing then, and it's doing nothing now." He straightened up, his voice rising. "But a man has a right to what is his. A man has a right to justice. And a man has a right to his wife." The saloon fell silent. Jonas, realizing he'd said too much, threw a few coins on the bar and stormed out. But the damage was done. The apathetic onlookers had heard his confession, and Brody had heard his motive. Jonas wasn't just a cruel drunk. He was a man consumed by a generations-old vendetta, a twisted obsession that had festered into a poisonous rage. He believed Colt's father had stolen his family's future, and he was using Evelyn as a pawn in a desperate, violent game to get it back. The search through her father's papers, the bank robbery, the abuse, it all snapped into a grim, coherent picture. Brody knew then that this was no longer a simple domestic matter. It was about to explode, and Colt Rollins and the family he was protecting were standing at the heart of the blast. 3 days later, they came. 3 riders cresting the rise at the edge of the Triple R property, their forms dark against the bright morning sky. Jonas sat tall in the saddle, flanked by 2 hard-looking men, Colt recognized as drifters, who sold their guns to the highest bidder, Garrett Lynch and Thomas Burke. Colt stepped out of the barn, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm, not raised, but ready. Evelyn watched from the kitchen window, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Margaret was safely inside, playing with a set of wooden blocks Colt had carved for her. "That's far enough," Jonas Colt's voice carried across the yard, clear and steady. "You know why I'm here." Rollins Jonas shouted back, his voice tight with a mixture of rage and feigned confidence. "I've come for my wife." "I don't see your wife," Colt replied, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I see a woman who chose freedom over a cage." "She's mine," Jonas roared the words tearing from his throat. "The law says so." "The law also has things to say about bank robbery and assault," Colt answered, letting the words hang in the hot, still air. "Are you willing to test which one the circuit judge will care about more?" Lynch shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting towards the pistol at his hip. Colt's rifle came up in a single fluid motion, the barrel pointing squarely at the gunman's chest. "Don't," Colt said flatly. "You won't leave this yard alive." The certainty in his voice was absolute. Lynch, a man who valued his own skin above any pay, froze. Suddenly, the front door of the house flew open. Margaret, her small face fierce with indignation, ran out onto the porch. "You leave Mr. Colt alone," she shouted, her tiny voice piping across the tense silence. "He's nice. He doesn't hurt people." Jonas's face twisted into a mask of pure fury. The sight of his daughter defending another man was a deeper wound than any bullet. "Get back inside, girl. This is men's business." Evelyn appeared behind her, pulling the child back gently, but placing herself in the doorway, a shield between her past and her future. Her voice, though it shook, was strong and clear. "She's braver than you'll ever be, Jonas. And I'm done taking your orders." The public defiance from both his wife and his child seemed to break something in Jonas. He saw Lynch subtly shaking his head, backing his horse away a step. Without his hired muscle, Jonas's courage evaporated. Spitting a stream of curses that fouled the clean morning air, he wheeled his horse and galloped away, Burke trailing behind him like a shadow. Colt slowly lowered his rifle. Margaret, freed from her mother's grasp, flung herself across the yard and into his arms, burying her face in his leg. He rested a hand on her head, his knuckles white. Evelyn met his eyes across the yard, and in that shared look 1,000 things were said. They had won the battle, but they both knew the war was far from over. That night, as stars blanketed the vast desert sky, Colt sat with Evelyn on the porch swing. The gentle creak of the chains was the only sound besides the chirping of crickets. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "I want to marry you, Evelyn," he said, his voice low and serious. "Proper, in the eyes of God and the law. I want to give you my name, and I want Margaret to have it too. I want to build a life with you right here." Tears welled in her eyes, shining in the starlight. "Then let's marry in our hearts right now," she whispered, "and let the papers come later. We're already a family, Colt. You, me, and Margaret. You made us one." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it, a pledge more binding than any vow spoken before a preacher. Jonas's vendetta had brought them together, but what they were building now was their own. It was a fortress of love and loyalty, and they would defend it together, whatever storms may come. Jonas Harper did not retreat to lick his wounds. He descended into a fever of obsession. The confrontation at the Triple R had stripped him of his public facade, revealing the desperate, cornered man beneath. He now understood that force alone wouldn't bring Evelyn back, and Colt Rollins was not a man who could be easily intimidated. His focus narrowed onto the one thing he believed held the key to his redemption, and the document he was convinced Evelyn's father had hidden a supposed confession or second deed that would prove Elias Rollins had stolen the Harper land. His new plan was colder, more cruel. He began watching the town, not the ranch. He learned the rhythms of Evelyn's new life from afar. He saw her take Margaret to Potts's mercantile for penny candy, saw her speak with the other women of Dust Rock, her head held higher than he had ever seen it. He saw the respect in their eyes when they looked at her, and it fueled his rage. They were judging him. The whole town was judging him. The opportunity he was waiting for came on a day when a fierce dust storm was blowing in from the south. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow, and the wind howled, scouring the streets with sand. Colt had ridden out early to check on a pregnant heifer in the north pasture, telling Evelyn he'd be back by noon. Sheriff Brody had taken his deputy to the next county to transfer a prisoner. Dust Rock was isolated, its vision obscured. Evelyn had taken Margaret into town to the small one-room schoolhouse, which also served as an informal gathering place for the town's women. As the storm worsened, Mrs. Potts suggested they all wait it out in the relative safety of the mercantile storeroom. It was there, amidst sacks of beans and barrels of pickles, that Jonas made his move. He didn't storm in with guns blazing. He slipped in through the back loading dock, his face masked by a bandana against the dust, a pistol held low at his side. The women gasped. He ignored them, his eyes locking on Margaret. "You," he said, his voice a low command to Evelyn. "The girl. We're leaving." Evelyn pushed Margaret behind her. "No, Jonas." "This isn't a negotiation," he snarled, raising the pistol. The women shrank back. "I'm taking what's mine. You have 1 hour. Meet me at the old Silver Creek mine. Bring me every last piece of paper your father ever owned. If you're late, or if you bring Rollins or the law, the girl pays the price." He grabbed Margaret's arm. The child cried out a sound of terror that sliced through Evelyn. Before anyone could react, Jonas dragged the struggling girl out into the blinding storm and was gone. The world tilted for Evelyn. For a moment, the suffocating dust and the panicked cries of the other women faded away. There was only the cold, sharp reality of Jonas's threat. He had taken her daughter. Colt felt the storm's fury long before he saw it. The wind tore at his hat, and the air grew thick with red dust. He turned shadow for home, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. When he arrived at the ranch, the house was empty. A cold dread sharper than the wind pierced through him. He spurred Shadow towards town, riding headlong into the teeth of the gale. He found Evelyn at the sheriff's office, her face pale with shock, but her eyes blazing with a fierce, determined light. She was explaining what happened to a frantic Samuel Potts. When she saw Colt, she ran to him. "He has her, Colt." He took Margaret. Colt's entire being went cold, then hot, with a rage so pure it was almost calming. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. "Where?" "The old Silver Creek mine, on the disputed land. He wants my father's papers." "It's not the papers he wants," Colt said, his mind racing, piecing it all together. "It's a trap. He wants me." "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice unshakable. "No, it's too dangerous." "She is my daughter, Evelyn," stated her voice ringing with an authority he had never heard from her before. "I know him. I know his weaknesses. You need me." He looked into her eyes and saw not a victim, but a warrior. He gave a single sharp nod. The ride to the mine was a battle against the elements. The wind screamed like a banshee, and dust swirled so thick they could barely see 10 feet ahead. They moved as 1-2 figures against a raging, hostile world. The Silver Creek mine was a dark scar on the side of a rocky mesa, a place long abandoned. Jonas stood at the entrance, holding a terrified Margaret in front of him, like a shield. The storm howled around them, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the scene in stark, ghostly tableaus. "You came alone," Jonas screamed over the wind. "Smart man Rollins." "Let the girl go," Jonas Colt called back, dismounting slowly, his hands held away from his gun. Evelyn did the same. "First the papers," Jonas demanded, his eyes wild and desperate. Evelyn held up the small wooden box she had brought from the ranch. "It's all here, Jonas," she said, her voice steady. "Everything my father left me. Now let her go." "Throw it over." Evelyn tossed the box. It landed in the dust between them. Jonas kept the gun on Margaret, his eyes darting from the box to Colt. This was the moment. "Your father wasn't a saint, you know." Jonas spat at Colt, his voice cracking with years of resentment. "He wasn't some noble pioneer. He was weak and a thief." "My father was an honorable man," Colt said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Was he?" Jonas laughed, a high, unhinged sound. "Then why did he ruin my family to pay off a blackmail debt to a cattle baron from back east? Your father wasn't greedy, Rollins. He was a coward. He bought this land with my father's blood to cover up a crime he committed before he ever came west. It's all in the county records. If you look hard enough, he destroyed my family to save his own reputation." The words hit Colt like a physical blow. The idealized memory of his father, the strong, silent man who had taught him the code of the West, cracked. He saw the truth in Jonas's crazed eyes. It wasn't a lie. It was the desperate, ugly truth of a man who had lost everything. His father's legacy was a lie, It was the distraction Evelyn needed. "You're the coward, Jonas," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "You talk about your father's pride. But what would he think of you now? A man who terrorizes a child, his own grandchild. He killed himself because he lost his land. You're killing yourself with hate." Jonas's head snapped towards her, his face contorted with rage. "You shut your mouth." In that split second, as his attention shifted, Colt moved. He dove forward, not for Jonas, but for the box, kicking it up and sending a cloud of dust and papers into the air. At the same time, Evelyn screamed and charged not at Jonas, but to the side, drawing his aim. The world exploded in sound and motion. Jonas's gun fired the bullet, whining past Evelyn's head and smacking into the rock wall of the mine. Margaret, momentarily free, scrambled away. Colt crashed into Jonas, and the two men went down in a tangle of limbs. It was not a clean fight. It was a brutal, desperate struggle in the dirt and wind. Fists flew, connecting with jarring force. They rolled and grappled, a storm of two men fueled by a generation of hate. Colt was stronger, but Jonas was powered by a maniacal fury. Finally, Colt gained the upper hand. He slammed Jonas's head against the rocky ground, stunning him. He drew his peacemaker, the cold steel, a heavy weight in his hand, and pressed the barrel against Jonas's forehead. He saw the flash of lightning reflected in Jonas's terrified eyes. He could end it. He could pull the trigger and erase this poison from their lives forever. Vengeance was a single satisfying twitch of his finger away. Then he heard it. "Daddy Colt." He looked over. Margaret was standing a few feet away, her small face streaked with tears and grime. Evelyn was holding her, her eyes fixed on him, full of trust and fear. He looked back down at the pathetic, beaten man beneath him. Killing him would not fix the past. It would not bring back his father's honor. It would only destroy the future he was trying to build, the man he was trying to become for Evelyn and for this child. He chose justice, not vengeance. He pulled back the hammer of his pistol, a deafening click in the wind. and then slowly, deliberately lowered it. He hauled Jonas to his feet just as Sheriff Brody and his deputy, having ridden hard through the storm, after being alerted by Samuel Potts, arrived on the scene. Brody took one look at the scene, the scattered papers, the sobbing child, the gun in Colt's hand, and understood. "It's over, Jonas," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with finality. As they led Jonas away in cuffs, a broken man stripped of his rage and left with only his failure, the storm began to break. The wind died down, and a gentle rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air, cleansing the land. Colt went to Evelyn and Margaret, enveloping them both in his arms. They stood there for a long time as the rain washed over them, a shattered family made whole again in the aftermath of the storm. The resolution of Jonas Harper's crimes was swift. Faced with charges of kidnapping, assault, and bank robbery, and with the entire town of Dust Rock now willing to testify against him, he was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison. The shadow he had cast over their lives was finally and truly gone. Weeks later, on a cool, clear evening, Colt sat before the fire in the ranch house. Evelyn was beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. Margaret slept peacefully in her room. On the small table before them lay 2 documents retrieved from the county seat by Sheriff Brody. One was the deed Elias Rollins had used to acquire the Harper land, a document now tainted by the truth of blackmail and cowardice. The other was the deed to the R, a testament to Colt's own hard work. Colt looked at the papers, at the spidery ink that represented so much pain, a legacy of lies and loss that had nearly destroyed them all. He picked up both deeds. "This land isn't about the past anymore," he said softly, his voice full of a conviction that settled deep in Evelyn's soul. "It's not about their sins or their sorrows. It's about the future we build on it. Our future." He tossed both documents into the heart of the fire. They watched as the flames curled around the edges, turning the paper black, consuming the old grievances and tainted legacies until they were nothing but ash. In that moment, he wasn't just burning paper. He was letting go of the idealized ghost of his father and the bitter ghost of Jonas's. He was choosing a new legacy, one that would begin with them. Months melted into a peaceful year. The ranch thrived. Laughter was now a permanent resident in the small house. Under a sprawling cottonwood tree by the creek, with the good women of Dust Rock weeping and cheering, and Margaret scattering wildflowers at their feet, Colt Rollins and Evelyn Harper were legally married. It was a formality, a simple piece of paper to sanctify a truth their hearts had known for a long time. One spring afternoon, as they worked side by side in the newly planted garden, Evelyn placed a hand on her still flat stomach and looked up at Colt, her eyes shining with a light he had never seen before. "The doctor in Prescott confirmed it," she said, her voice a soft, wondrous whisper. "We're going to have a baby." Colt dropped the shovel he was holding. He knelt before her, placing his calloused, gentle hand over hers on her belly. He looked from her radiant face to the rich earth beneath them, to the wide and endless Arizona sky above. Here on this land, cleansed by fire and rain, they would plant their roots. Here they would raise their daughter and welcome new life. Here they would build their future, not on the broken foundations of the past, but on the unshakable bedrock of a family forged in courage and redeemed by love.